Yesterday he laughed, raising a glass at a corporate party, successful, confident, in an expensive suit. He had a wife, a daughter, his own home, and an office where subordinates waited for his decision. He sincerely believed that life was conquered and no trifle would destroy his empire. Today he lies in a stuffy hospital ward, covered with drips, and listens to the doctor's cold verdict. Liver cancer, for weeks at most. He tries to remember when exactly one glass of wine turned into an abyss that took everything away. And the worst thing is, even now, knowing that the end is near, he catches himself thinking, I would drink a little more to ease this pain. He had 4 weeks left. Not 20 years, not 10, but 4 tiny, miserable weeks, which the doctor measured out in a cold and almost indifferent voice. The words, liver cancer, terminal stage, fell on him like a sentence from which there was no escape. Now he lay in a cramped, stuffy hospital ward with cracked walls and yellow lamplight, hooked up to IVs, and thinking only of one thing. How did this happen? And once he was completely different. Tall, confident, with an expensive watch on his wrist and a winner's smile. He had a job where he was respected and listened to, his own office with a view of the city, a house with a garden, and a wife who greeted him after work with a warm kiss. His daughter ran to meet him with a book in her hands and joyfully shouted, "Daddy is home." He was what they call a successful man, a man who was envied, a man who could afford everything. And all this was destroyed by one thing. Not war, not bankruptcy, not someone else's betrayal, but a glass of wine. One and only glass at a corporate party, which seemed like an innocent trifle. He drank, relaxed, felt as if life finally had a real taste. At that time, he did not even suspect that at that moment he was signing an invisible contract, a contract for a slow death. Now, with his body destroyed by disease and his soul eroded by guilt, he tries to remember. Where was that line? Where was the moment when he could have stopped? And why didn't he? Everything he had was gone. His family gone, his job a thing of the past, his friends turned away. All that remained was the bottle, his faithful executioner and false friend. The scariest thing isn't even the doctor's verdict. The scariest thing is that, sitting in the ward and looking out the window at the autumn sky, he catches himself thinking, I would drink more, at least a sip, to make it easier to breathe. By the age of 40, he had achieved everything most people dream of. His day began with a cup of coffee in his own kitchen, where his wife would set out freshly baked bread and smile as if she still believed he was the same guy she had married. His daughter, 7 years old, would always run out of the room in her pony pajamas, jump into his arms, and whisper, "Dad, I miss you." And every time he would feel a warm feeling in his chest, it was pure happiness. The job also gave a sense of stability and pride. He headed a department in a large company. His colleagues listened to him carefully because his words carried weight. He had his own office with a panoramic window overlooking the city, a leather chair, and a desk always littered with plans and contracts. But for him, it wasn't a burden. He loved his job. Business meetings, negotiations, presentations. He felt like the captain of a ship, confidently leading the team through any storms. After work, he would get into his new car and drive home. In the yard, his daughter would meet him, who was already waiting with a ball in her hands. "Dad, let's play." And he would throw his jacket on a chair and run into the yard, laughing, forgetting about his fatigue. They spent their evenings having a family dinner, talking, joking, and making plans for the future. His wife would sometimes joke, "You work forever, but you still find time for us. I don't know how you do it." He would just smile, because it seemed to him that life was truly in his hands. On weekends, he loved to go out of town. Fresh air, barbecue, friends, his daughter running barefoot on the grass. He liked to feel like part of a big, friendly circle. He had money, he had recognition, he had a family, and he was sure that it would never end. He was the kind of person that others looked up to. You see, he did it. His colleagues would say, "He's a real family man." His neighbors would say. He himself believed that his success was the result of discipline, willpower, and intelligence. He didn't even consider the idea that everything could fall apart. No one could have imagined that there was already a crack in this life, which seemed perfect, that the day would come when he would sit down at the table at another corporate party, take a glass of wine in his hand, and this moment would be the beginning of his end. It happened almost imperceptibly. Another corporate party, celebrating a big deal that he personally led to the finale. Music was playing in the restaurant. Tables were bursting with food. Glasses were clinking from toasts. He had never been a fan of alcohol. He could afford a beer on the weekend or champagne on New Year's. But this time, everything was different. His colleagues insisted, "You're the hero of the evening. Without you, nothing would have worked out. Come on, let's drink to your success." He took a glass of wine. Red, thick, with a pleasant aroma. A sip, a second, and suddenly a wave of warmth spread over his body, as if someone had, with one movement, removed the tension of all the past months from him. The noise in his head quieted, the anxiety disappeared, the words flowed easily, and the laughter seemed louder. He felt that he could be even more confident, even more relaxed. And for the first time in a long time, it seemed to him that life had a real taste. Alcohol acted like a master chess player. He did everything right. At first, it gave him a feeling of lightness, as if a burden had been lifted. Then it gave him courage. He joked with his colleagues, raised toasts, even danced, which he usually never did. And most importantly, he received approval. People around him looked at him with smiles, friendly words, and he felt like the center of attention. That evening, for the first time, he thought, maybe this is what I've been missing. He had a home, a family, a job, but he always carried within him an invisible fatigue, pressure, a trembling anxiety about tomorrow. Alcohol took it away in an instant, and his brain, flooded with a wave of dopamine, whispered to him, "This is it. This is how it should always be." After the corporate party, he returned home later than usual, but was surprisingly in a good mood. His wife was surprised. "Are you drunk?" He laughed. "No, it's just a successful party." And he told himself, "It's okay. Once in a lifetime." But a new thought had already settled in his head. He remembered that taste, that lightness, that feeling of freedom from worries. And in the following days, when he sat in his office over the next few reports and contracts, somewhere in his subconscious a memory would appear, a glass of wine. How simple it was. How good it was. The alcohol had already done its job. He threw the first bait. And the man had no idea that from now on he would live with a new friend who would gradually become an executioner. One evening, when he was returning home drunk, the entrance greeted him with deafening silence. The apartment door was locked from the inside, and the key suddenly wouldn't fit. He pulled the handle, banged his fist on the door, even shouted his wife's name. But there was no answer. The neighbor downstairs came out and said dryly, "She took the children and left." Where? Think for yourself. This moment was his first real blow. Something inside him seemed to break, but strangely enough, not from pain, but from emptiness. He thought he would cry, rush to look for them. But instead he silently went downstairs, bought another bottle, and sat down on a bench near the entrance. They left me anyway. Why hold on then? He convinced himself. Later, new blows came. He was fired from his job. The boss called him in, looked him straight in the eye, and said without emotion, "You're a good specialist, but you can't continue like this. You're dangerous for the company." He shrugged. Work, family, friends, everything went smoothly. But strangely, he didn't feel any real regret. Alcohol did its job. It drowned out any emotions, turned his heart into a cold stone. The only thing that still stirred a spark in him were rare dreams. In his dreams, he saw his daughter running towards him down the corridor, shouting, "Dad." He would wake up in a cold sweat, but instead of calling her, he would reach for the bottle. These dreams were like warnings. But during the day, he would chase them away like annoying flies. Tomorrow I will start a new life, he told himself. Tomorrow. But tomorrow was always far away, and today ended in cheap booze. That fall, he almost stopped distinguishing days. Time rolled into one gray strip, as if his whole life now was just smoke from a cigarette and liquid in a glass. But somewhere in the depths of his soul, a silent, invisible spectator was emerging. He silently watched the hero of his own story roll down, and waited for the moment when this soulless spectacle would finally end. Because something more than just loss was about to happen next. It happened suddenly, like a bolt of lightning in a quiet sky. One morning, he was awakened by the ringing of the telephone. The telephone rang for a long time on the floor, and, still half-conscious, he picked up the receiver. On the other end was his younger brother. His voice trembled, and the words came out in short pieces. "Dad, heart attack. The ambulance didn't make it in time." He froze. It was as if the world had stopped, and the air had become heavy and sticky. Only one thought was beating loudly in his head. I didn't even say goodbye. And for the first time in a long time, he felt real pain. Not physical, but the kind that rips from the inside, not letting him breathe. He remembered how his father had once said, "Son, the main thing is not to drink. You are strong. Don't let yourself be lost." Then he had just brushed it off. And now those words cut like a knife. At the funeral, he stood aside. The faces of his relatives were angry and indifferent at the same time. Some turned away, others looked with condemnation. His mother only said, "If you were different, maybe your father would have suffered less." His soul sank even deeper. And it was then that the desire to leave all this hell first appeared. He swore to himself, "Tomorrow I will not drink. Tomorrow I will start a new life." But the next day he was standing outside the store again with a bottle in his hands. And he hated himself for it. He drank quickly, greedily, as if trying to drown out the voice in his head that whispered, "You're a weakling. You betrayed your father." Every attempt to quit ended in failure. He hid the bottles, swore it was the last time, pounded the wall with his fists. But alcohol always won. His body reached for it like a lifebuoy, and his soul screamed with shame. At night he lay and listened to his own heart. It beat faster than ever, as if warning, "You won't last long like this." Sometimes he would panic. He imagined himself dying suddenly, like his father. But unlike his father, he would die useless, forgotten, and smelling of alcohol. This fear was the first real push. And even though he was returning to the bottle, somewhere deep inside him a struggle was already beginning. A struggle to prove to himself that he could still be human. Because the biggest enemy was not alcohol, but himself. He tried to quit dozens of times. Each attempt began with promises to himself. "That's it. This is the last drink. Tomorrow I'll start living a new life." But in reality, each last turned into an even deeper hole. The first day without alcohol seemed like hell. His body was shaking. His hands wouldn't obey. He was sweating as if he were running away from his own skin. The sun was stinging his eyes. The ringing in his ears was so loud that he could barely hear the people around him. His brain was screaming for one thing: drink. And he was breaking down. Before lunch he would go to the store, take the cheapest drink, and swallow it in big gulps. And then that sweet relief would come. The shaking would disappear. His head would become light. His heart would beat in rhythm again. But these hours of high quickly turned into a nightmare. The next day after the binge, he felt sick from everything, even the smell of water. The walls swayed like a ship's cabin during a storm. It seemed to him that someone was constantly knocking from inside his skull, knocking his brain out. At night, he would have hallucinations. He would see shadows in the corner, hear voices calling his name. Once he was so scared that he jumped out of bed and hid in the bathroom, convinced that he was being watched. The body demanded more. Alcohol no longer brought happiness. It only drove away the torment. Without a bottle, a breakdown. With a bottle, poison. And this cycle tore him to pieces. The wife filed for divorce. She couldn't stand it when her daughter asked one evening, "Mom, why does Dad always smell like gasoline?" Those words were a blow. But even then he didn't stop. He drank twice as much. He was fired from his job. His former friends wouldn't pick up the phone. He was left alone in his four walls, with empty bottles under his bed and a bell in his head. Sometimes he woke up in a pool of his own vomit. And instead of horror, he felt only one thing: shame. He began to lose control of his body. His hands shook so badly that he could not sign a document or even bring a spoon to his mouth. His face turned yellow, his eyes sunken. He saw in the mirror not a man, but a broken corpse still walking. And yet, every time he got a few hours of clarity, he swore to himself, "This time I'll make it." And each time he fell even lower. Alcohol was no longer an option. He became the master, and he was the slave, paying for this high with his life, health, and the remnants of human dignity. He had been feeling unwell for a long time, but he didn't pay attention. He attributed the pain under his ribs to bad food, the yellowness of his face to fatigue, and the constant taste of blood in his mouth to his teeth. But one morning he woke up in his own bed, the pillow all covered in blood and vomit. He could barely get up, his hands shaking so much that he couldn't button his shirt. And then, for the first time in years, he went to the hospital himself. A stony-faced doctor met him in the corridor. After the examinations, he was taken into the office. The doctor's words were as dry and cold as a gunshot. "You have liver cancer. Terminal stage. For weeks maximum." He sat, staring at one point and not hearing half of what was said. It seemed to him that the walls were moving, as if the world had moved away and he was left alone, naked, doomed. He didn't even react right away. He just muttered, "For weeks." The doctor added, without even changing his tone, "We can support his life a little with IVs. But the process is irreversible. The liver is destroyed." He left the office, holding onto the walls. In the hallway, the nurse looked at him with sympathy, but also aloofness, the way one looks at someone who has already been written off. A wave of panic swept over him. He wanted to scream, to smash everything around him, to run somewhere, just to avoid hearing about these 4 weeks. But instead, he went to the nearest store and bought a bottle. He sat down on the bench, unscrewed the cap, and felt that the alcohol was no longer intoxicating. It didn't give him any high or lightness. It was only adding a little more poison to his already collapsed body. But his hand was lifting the neck of the bottle to his mouth by itself. And even now, knowing the sentence, he couldn't stop. When he returned home, the mirror showed him a terrible picture: a gray, haggard face, yellow eyes, hands bruised from IVs and falls. He looked at least 20 years older than his years. That night he sat on the floor for a long time, his head in his hands. His daughter stood before his eyes. He didn't even remember the last time he had seen her with sober eyes. And the scariest thing was the realization: he might not even have time to ask for forgiveness. He had 28 days left, and each of them would be his last. The first week he lived in panic. The hospital, the pills, the IVs, it all seemed unreal. He tried to escape the truth, and even now, doomed, he reached for the bottle. Alcohol no longer brought intoxication, only a brief oblivion. But every sip burned his throat, as if someone had poured acid inside. In the second week, he came to his senses. He could no longer walk straight. His legs would buckle, and he would fall like a child learning to walk. His whole body was covered in bruises from the slightest blows. He would look in the mirror and see his skin turning earthy and his eyes turning completely yellow. But what killed him most was not his body, but the thought: "I ruined everything myself." He tried to call his wife. "Let me see my daughter." His voice broke, almost a whisper. She was silent for a few seconds, then answered, "She doesn't remember you sober. You're a stranger to her." These words pierced his heart harder than any diagnosis. He fell to the floor with the phone in his hand and lay in the darkness for a long time, feeling nothing but emptiness. In the third week, He tried to make amends. He stopped buying alcohol. For the first time in years, he forced himself to walk past a store. His hands shook, his head throbbed with pain, but he walked. For a few days, he was clean. He even wrote a letter to his daughter. "Forgive me. Dad ruined everything. I wanted to be a hero, but I became a shadow. I love you." He didn't know if she would ever read these lines. But the body did not forgive. The pain became unbearable. The liver was rotting inside, spreading throughout the body. His thin hands trembled as if they were living their own lives. He was out of breath even after taking a few steps. The doctors just threw up their hands. "We can ease the pain, but there will be no miracle." The fourth week was like waiting for an execution. He counted the days, sometimes even the hours. Every night was a battle with fear. He was afraid to fall asleep because it became more and more difficult to wake up. He prayed like never before, without pathos, simply begging God to let him see his daughter again. And one evening it happened. She entered the hospital ward, a tall, teenage girl with sad eyes. She stood silently by the door. He didn't even have the strength to get up. He just held out his trembling hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She didn't answer, but she came closer and touched his hand. And in that moment he cried. Tears flowed for the first time in years. Real, pure, without alcohol. 3 days later he was gone. In his last minutes, he remembered only one thing: the warm touch of his daughter's hand. After his death, only empty bottles, yellowed photographs, and a few sheets of paper with crooked lines remained in the apartment. His letters to his daughter. The house, once full of laughter, has now become a tomb of memories. Neighbors, passing by the door, only shook their heads. There was a man, and now he's gone. He's drunk. There were not many people at the funeral. A few former colleagues who came more out of duty than out of genuine sadness. The wife stood aside, holding her daughter's hand tightly. She didn't cry. Her tears had dried up years before. And the daughter simply remained silent, looking at the coffin with empty eyes. She didn't yet realize that she had lost not her father, because alcohol had long since taken him, but the chance to have a real dad someday. Alcohol didn't kill him suddenly. It slowly stole his life day by day, tearing apart his body, his soul, his relationships. And in the end, it left a ruin in its wake.